Jordan. So that's what you can kind of picture. We're right on the border of Israel and Jordan. And this area, Decapolis, actually means 10 cities. Okay, so it was named after that because there was kind of this coalition of 10 cities that banded together, and they called themselves Decapolis, exactly what the word means. And I think it's important to know these things because Jesus is coming right back to the same area where he freed that demoniac man. Remember the guy that was in the graveyard and they had to chain him because he was so out of control? That was in the land of the Gerasenes, or the Gadarenes. It's called both. And that is one of the cities mentioned in Decapolis. That's one of the 10 cities. So they're in the same area, but they're talking about a larger area when it's referenced. And so those are good things to note. I tend to appreciate the geography when I'm studying through the Bible. I remember when I was a young believer and studying the Bible, I never paid attention to the geography. I just always in my mind, oh, Israel. Oh, it's in Israel. Oh, it's in Israel. But he goes all over the region, right? Last week we saw him go into Lebanon. Now he's gone into Syria. Now he's going into Jordan. So really powerful to learn and understand those things. Now, as we jump into today's text in chapter 8, we're in that same area of Decapolis. Now, I've titled today's message, Don't Be Spiritually Blind. Now, this might not make sense to you in the beginning as we start going through chapter 8, but keep that in the back of your mind and see as we go through that if you can't make connections of being spiritually blind. And I think you'll see it as we go through this. But definitely by the end of the message, we'll come back to that theme. Don't be spiritually blind, and see if we can connect it all together. All right, let's go ahead and jump in. And I want to start by reading just the first 4 verses. We'll take a small chunk to start with. Chapter 8, verse 1. In those days, the multitude being very great and having nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples to him and said to them, I have compassion on the multitude because they have now continued with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. Verse 3, and if I send them away hungry to their own houses, they will faint on the way, for some of them have come from afar. Then his disciples answered him, how can one satisfy these people with bread here in the wilderness? Can you guys hear me okay? Yeah. Okay, I'm not sure if my speaker's working or not, so I'll try to speak loud. But all right. Now, if you guys have a study Bible in your lap or you're using an app that has titles, you know that we're jumping into the area of Jesus feeding the 4,000, okay? So we haven't quite got into the thick of that yet, but that's what we're jumping into in this section. Now, some liberal scholars have gone as far to say that the feeding of the 4,000 is the same event of Jesus feeding the 5,000. Okay? I totally disagree with that, but that's what they have said, many of them. And they want to blame it on things like it was a copy error. The writer of the gospel was confused and he mixed up the story and thought it was a different one. Okay, I know, really bad excuse or explanation of why they believe that, but there are those who believe that. And I think that the scriptures here is very clear to tell us that this is a different event, okay? And I want to mention a few things that really solidifies that, because I think it's kind of a head scratcher that they think that this is a separate event. Okay, we have the different number of people that were served, right? We're given a specific number, 5,000 and 4,000. So there's that difference. We're also given the geographic regions of where both of these meals took place. Again, geography is good, right? The feeding of the 5,000 was on the northwest side of the lake. The feeding of the 4,000 that we're looking at today is on the southeast side of the lake. So opposite sides of the lake. And we also know that during the feeding of the 5,000, the people were with Jesus all day, but it was only one day. Did you catch when we read the first 4 verses that they were with him for 3 days? So that was a long time, you know. These people were following him around, listening to him teach and watching his miracles and being healed by him during that 3-day event. But I think exactly what we have recorded here is exactly how it played out. In fact, we're even going to see later that Jesus specifically makes reference to both events as different events. So if anybody ever tells you, that's the same event, you can say, no, it's not. There's plenty of differences to point out on the contrary. So as I mentioned, the multitude here is following Jesus, right, for 3 days. Now, they've been away from their homes. We can even assume that they weren't planning to be away for 3 days, right? I imagine they went out excited to see Jesus. They start hearing his teachings. They start seeing him perform miracles. And then they get caught up in the moment, right? They just start following him around as he's walking around in the wilderness. This guy's great. This is the Messiah, right? They're just enthralled in what Jesus is doing and teaching. So much so that they forgot food, lodging, change of clothing. What about their affairs back home? Maybe they had children, wives back home, their farm animals, their fields. They just left it all behind because they wanted to be with Jesus. And so this is a really awesome picture. I really appreciate this account of the feeding of the 4,000. The other thing that we have to realize that in ancient times, especially so much more the case, is that they had to plan out their meals, right? They didn't have microwaves. They didn't have a stove where they could just easily go pop a pizza in the oven, right? They had to think about it like, I'm going to have to get the sheep out of the field and go pick some vegetables to make a stew, right? They really had to think ahead. Now, it's true that they would bring food with them. They might bake some bread, take a pocket full of nuts with them so that they would have stuff to munch on along the way. But these people were not prepared for a 3-day fast, okay? And it was a fast. And so now there's this dilemma, right? People are going hungry. They don't have a place to stay. And Jesus starts having compassion on the people. Right? We read that in the first account, the feeding of the 5,000. We told that Jesus had compassion on the crowd. And it's the same thing here. But let's really paint the picture of what it was like for these people. Being away from home, following Jesus. And as I mentioned, they were fasting. Let's say that at most, maybe they had a day's supply of bread on them. That means they've gone 2 days without food. That's quite a long time. But being with Jesus, that really is what fasting is all about. I appreciate what Pastor Paul Laboudier out of Calvary Chapel, Ontario, he says that fasting is primarily spending time with Jesus. So often we associate it with food, right? We're foregoing food. And that is fasting. That's the medical term of fasting. But we're trying to see this from the side of the spiritual, right? And that's what it is, to spend time with the Lord. Foregoing everything. And we can relate this to our modern lives, right? Think of all the distractions we have in life that we can put aside to spend time with Jesus. It might be food. It may not be. What about our computers, our laptops, our cell phones, our tablets, the television, right? There's so many things that we can turn off to go to Jesus, to be in the presence of the Lord. And that's what fasting is truly about. I know I've shared this story with you before, but I'll do it again since it really speaks to this context. Maybe some of you haven't heard it, but when I was a younger believer, I wanted to fast. I probably heard a teaching on it in church, and I'm like, I'm going to do it. I'm going to fast. And I was all gung-ho about it, excited about it. And I went for 2.5 days without eating food. And I was really proud of myself, for sticking to it. I was doing it, and it was painful. If any of you have fasted for a period of time, it was really hard to do. But I started on a Sunday, and I spent most of the majority of Sunday with the Lord. But come around Monday, I was still going without food, but it was just a normal day. I went to work, did my normal routine, came home, probably goofed off. The next day, same thing, went to work, caved at lunch, and gave in to the food. But somewhere in that time, my beautiful wife, so sweet and so wise, said something to me that was like a spiritual light bulb moment. She said, how good is it, and I'm paraphrasing, but how good is it to fast and not spend time with God? I think at the time I was playing a video game, just something real mature. And she was like, you're avoiding food, but you're not spending time with Jesus. She got it. I didn't. What I was doing was essentially a hunger strike, right? I was just going without food, but going around my normal routine. None of that time was really devoted to Jesus. And so that made sense to me. That was kind of my aha moment through the wisdom of my wife. And so I realized, it's probably better to only fast one day, to go without food and turn everything off and spend a full day with Jesus rather than, playing a game of not eating food and only spending a half a day with Jesus, or one devotional kind of a thing. And so that's the main point that I wanted to make with the fact that these people were fasting. And that's what we see here, right? A true fast, because they are wanting to hang with Jesus. So much so that they forsook everything else in their lives. They left it all behind just to be with Jesus. And so, we can think of these things. Denying food is great. Turning off our cell phone is fantastic. Taking off work to spend with the Lord is fabulous. And turning off the TV can be really peaceful. But if I'm not spending that time with Jesus, it's all for naught, right? It really just comes down to denying oneself pleasures of the flesh and nothing more if you're not spending it with the Lord. And so I hope that maybe ministers to some of you if you've never fasted, or if you've been thinking about fasting, or maybe even if you were like me and you've done fasting the wrong way in the past. Maybe that's an encouragement to do it more biblically accurate in the future. And that's exactly what we're seeing here with this multitude, spending that 3 days with the Lord. 3 solid days. That's a long time, forsaking all. We can also say, during those times, as I mentioned earlier, that they spent so much time in preparing for meals, grinding the grain and, to make flour, just every little thing that we take for granted, right? We go buy a bag of sugar or a bag of flour, and that's if we even want to make something from scratch, if you will. But all their planning that they were foregoing as well was all dedicated to the Lord. It took them several hours to make one meal in those days. And so avoiding meal was a big time saver, a lot of time that you could spend with the Lord for sure. All right, now this miracle of feeding the 4,000 is interesting because it's so similar to the 5,000. And that's probably one of the jumping off point that the liberal scholars jumped off at. They'd say, this is so similar to the 5K that it might be the same event. We've already established it's not, but I think that's one of the reasons that they took that stance. Now, the thing that's fascinating here is that if we look at all the other descriptive healings, or I should say non-descriptive healings that Jesus did, right? they may say he cast out many demons, right? We read that over and over again. But we don't have any repeated miracles in the Bible other than the feeding of the thousands, right? Jesus doesn't walk on water more than once. He doesn't turn water into wine more than once. He doesn't take money out of the fish more than once. But here we have him multiplying the loaves of bread and the fish so that he can feed thousands of people, right? Two very similar events. And so that's pretty fascinating to me. And anytime that we read repetition in the Bible, we should pay attention. You know, anytime God repeats himself, boy, that little spiritual antenna better go up. And that's one of the cases that we have here. Now, one of the things that I want you to notice here that the disciples asked, and it's right in verse 4. They say, how can one satisfy these people with bread here in the wilderness? How can they be satisfied? How is this possible? So keep that in mind as we finish up this account, okay? Let's read verses 5 through 10. He asked them, how many loaves do you have? And they said, 7. So he commanded the multitude to sit down on the ground, and he took the 7 loaves and gave thanks, broke them and gave them to his disciples to set before them. And they set them before the multitude. Verse 7. They also had a few small fish, and having blessed them, he said to set them also before them. And so they ate and were filled. And they took up 7 large baskets of leftover fragments. Verse 9, now those who had eaten were about 4,000, and he sent them away, immediately got into the boat with his disciples, and came to the region of Dalmanutha. All right, so back to that question that the disciples asked. How can one satisfy these people with bread here in the wilderness? Did not Jesus already do that before? They were a part of it. Do you remember when we studied through that? One of the things that I focused on during the feeding of the 5,000 was the fact that Jesus challenged them. He tested their faith. What did he ask the disciples during the feeding of the 5,000? He said, or I should say what he commanded them, you give them something to eat. You give them something to eat. And that was a real challenge to their faith. What, Lord, you want us to feed these 5,000 people with just a few loaves of bread and a few fish? How are we going to do that? But then Jesus worked that great miracle, and now they come back to that same question of doubt. How is it possible that we could feed 4,000 people in the wilderness? How quickly they forgot. Now, this time is very similar to the 5,000, right? Jesus is having compassion on them the same way that he did before. But I believe Jesus is testing the disciples here again. There's so much more going on here besides just a miracle, besides just feeding 4,000 people who were seeking out Jesus. Part of the Lord's will and desire here is to reach the heart of his disciples. Right? He wants them to understand. Do you guys remember when we studied through the 5,000? Jesus said that, well, I've got the verse for you here. I'll just pull it up. He said, for they had not understood about the loaves because their hearts were hardened. Do you remember that? They didn't understand it because their hearts were hardened. And so Jesus is coming back to this. He's giving them the test again. But this time he even went easier on them, right? He didn't say, you give them something to eat. All he asked them was, how many loaves of bread do you have? And then he performed the miracle. But he wanted to see, how are you going to respond this time? Are you going to have faith this time? Or are you going to be hard-hearted again? So this is the second test for the disciples. Are your hearts still hard? I had a Bible study leader make this statement. Maybe you agree with it, maybe you don't. But he said, if you don't learn from the lessons that the Lord has in front of you, God will have you circle back again and again until you pass the test. Now, I'm not fully committed to that opinion as a doctrine, but I know that God does do this. Right? I've experienced this in my own life, where he'll just keep me coming back to the same thing until I have that aha moment, right? The spiritual light goes on. Maybe some of you guys have experienced that. But I've also seen, where we have trials or tests that come and then we move on. It's not to say that we're always spinning around in circles going nowhere just because we're failing a test of the Lord. But this is also a biblical concept, right? We've seen this going through the Old Testament. Remember the Israelites wandering in the desert for 40 years because of their hard hearts and because of their disbelief. 40 years of spinning circles. If you've read the book of Judges, it has a cyclical pattern to it of the nation being obedient to God, falling into idolatry, falling into sin, falling away from the Lord, being judged by the Lord, being tested, repenting, and then coming back to the Lord again. And all throughout Judges, it just repeats that cycle. We're back with the Lord, we're falling away. We're back with the Lord, we're falling away. And so I do believe that it is a biblical concept, that the Lord keeps bringing us back to things so that we get it. He wants us to understand, just like the disciples. You guys need to understand this. You need to have the right heart in this matter. Now, it's one of those things, too, as I already mentioned. I don't think we should be dogmatic about it, or that, if somebody's struggling, that we accuse them of being in disobedience, or that they're spinning circles because they're not fully understanding from the Lord. But he does want us to grasp it. And also, when we look back at the Israelites, often it's so easy for us to look at them and say, man, they were so stubborn and so hard-hearted, right? Especially when we read through the Exodus, and the nation of Israel came out of captivity and they saw the great miracles, the pillar of smoke by day, the pillar of fire by night, the parting of the Red Sea. They saw all those things, and yet they were so stubborn and so hard-hearted. But we can fall into that same trap, right? We can miss the signs of the Lord trying to show us something new, trying to teach us a lesson, or that we would pass the test. And so I'll leave that with you. I'll leave that with you to ponder and pray over for your own walk. Maybe the Lord will reveal an area in your life where you're spinning circles. You keep coming back to the same issue or the same struggle. Maybe God's testing you once again. So that's something for you to pray over. All right, now, similar to before, during the feeding of the 5,000, what we see here in the 4,000 is that there were several leftovers, right? An abundance of leftovers. In fact, just like before, they have more leftovers than what they started with. Remember, in this account, they started with 7 loaves. How many baskets of leftovers did they collect? 7 baskets. That means they had more than what they started with. Isn't that so amazing? This also teaches us how abundant the Lord is in his blessings, right? The Lord showers blessings on us far more than we ever sow in, far more than we ever give. God just showers us in his goodness. And it's always more than what we had before. And that's exciting to me, because Jesus said that he is the living water. Remember when he was talking to the woman at the well? I am that living water. And he says, those who put their faith and trust in me will drink torrents of living water. And he says that that's what the spring is like inside of us. That Holy Spirit comes into us. It's like an overflowing fountain. So much more than we could ever drink ourselves. But that's the way God does it, right? He's so abundant in his blessing. He also relates this to giving. Look at what it says here in Luke 6:38. He says, "Give, and it will be given to you. Good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over. It will be put in your lap," or your bosom if you're in the King James. "For with the same measure that you use it will be measured back to you." See, when we give, the blessings are returned back to us. The Lord is so good and he blesses us so much that he gives back more than what we give. We can never outgive God. That's such an awesome thing. But there's something more to the abundance in which he gives, because it's not always about what we receive as the giver or that we are received as the one being blessed, because there's far more than what we need. And so why is it? Why is that the case? Why is the Spirit overflowing, running over? Why does God give in return over what we give? It's for the sake of other people. Right? The Lord wants us to use that abundance. He wants to use that abundance to reach other people. And that's exactly what we see here in the account of the feeding of the 4,000. Look what Jesus asked them. "How many loaves do you have?" They replied, 7. Jesus took every loaf of bread that they had, but he multiplied it. And he fed 4,000 people from 7 loaves of bread. But what did the disciples get in return? 7 baskets of leftovers. They had very close, most likely more than what they started with. And that's the way God liberally gives to us. But it's the thousands of people that he touches with that overflow. And so the more we can be a vessel, a fountain, a bread factory, the more we can be used for the Lord in that way, the more people he can touch, right? The more we give, the more God will give and multiply back to reach other people. And so that's a great example of what we're reading here in this account. The blessings of the Lord spill over. All right, now immediately following that miracle, they get into the boat again, right? We read about this every week. Hop in the boat, go across the other side of the Sea of Galilee. This time they're going to a new place, a place called Dalmanutha. Okay, Dalmanutha was a small valley just south of Capernaum. Capernaum was kind of the main base where Peter and Andrew lived. Okay, so they go back to that area quite often, but that's where they're heading now. So let's go ahead and pick it up in verse 11. "When the Pharisees came out and began to dispute with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven, testing him. But he sighed deeply in his spirit and said, 'Why does this generation seek a sign? Assuredly, I say to you, no sign shall be given to this generation.'" All right, now as we read through the ministry of Jesus, so often, right, he has these conflicts with the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scribes, the religious leaders, right? And so we know that they followed him often. They sought him out. Now, were they seeking him out of faith? Were they seeking out Jesus to find out the truth? No, in fact, we're even told here that they began to dispute with him and that they were testing him, right? They were trying to expose Jesus as a fraud. That was their main motivation, to seek out Jesus. Now, Jesus here They asked for him to perform a heavenly miracle, right? A sign from heaven. That's what they're trying to get him to do. Now, Jesus didn't do it. He denied their request to see a sign. And we've talked about this before when Jesus said this very same thing, right? This is a perverse generation that seeks a sign. He's saying the same thing about the Sadducees and Pharisees here. Now, here's the thing. What if God would have showed them a sign? Would they have believed? I don't think so. I don't think they would have. Because they've already seen signs. They've been following Jesus. Anytime he comes to the area, everybody flocks. They want to see what's going on as much as the multitudes. They've seen the healings. They've seen the feeding, possibly during the 5,000. It was up in that same area. They've seen people raised from the dead. They've seen Jesus perform all these miracles. What more of a sign do these people need to see? They had the scriptures that pointed to Jesus performing all of these miracles. They probably had them memorized. And they didn't recognize Jesus because they had hard hearts, because of their disbelief. And their disbelief was so great that even if Jesus would have showed them a sign right there on the spot, he knew they wouldn't convert. And that's why he denied their request. Look at this verse I'll have on the screen here, Matthew 11:5. These are the signs that Jesus performed. At one point, John the Baptist sent his followers to Jesus. And he wanted his followers to ask Jesus, "Are you the Messiah, or should we look for another?" This was the Lord's response. Go back and tell John, "The blind see, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear. The dead are raised up, and the poor have the gospel preached to them." Essentially, what he was saying to the followers of John, here's your sign. I have already fulfilled these signs. Now, those things that are mentioned there in Matthew actually come from the book of Isaiah in two different spots. So for you note takers, if you want to jot these down, you can look them up later. But it's Isaiah 32:3 and Isaiah 35:5. You can go look at those two verses and you'll find the same elements that are in the Matthew 11:5 verse. Now I bring that up because they should have recognized their Messiah when he came. They should have known that Jesus was perfectly fulfilling all these signs, all these prophecies that were made. But they didn't because they were hard-hearted. And we're told here that Jesus sighed in his spirit. Isn't that interesting? The Lord sighed in his spirit. You know, Jesus is also called a man of sorrows in the prophecies, speaking of the Messiah. And it's because he desired so much that they would have faith. He loved the Jews. He loved the Pharisees. He loved the Sadducees. And he wanted to see them saved, but they were not willing. Remember when he went above Jerusalem and he wept over the city? He said, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how I long for you to draw near to me. How I want to put you under my wings and shelter you and care for you. But you were not willing." And that's why Jesus is sighing in his spirit. You know, he was really tough on the Pharisees and Sadducees, wasn't he? He called them some pretty strong words, whitewashed tombs, pit of vipers, son of your father, Satan. He talked very tough with them. But he still desired for them to be saved. But this was breaking his heart right now because they weren't getting it, right? They weren't seeing the prophecies fulfilled. And Jesus is here saying, I've already done these things for you guys. If you don't believe in that, you're not going to believe at all. Now, this leads into Jesus giving his disciples a personal warning about the Pharisees, about the Sadducees, about Herod. So let's read on, verses 13 through 21. And he left them, and getting into the boat again, departed to the other side. Now the disciples had forgotten to take bread, and they did not have more than one loaf with them in the boat. Then he charged them, saying, Take heed, be aware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. And they reasoned among themselves, saying, It is because we have no bread. 17. But Jesus, being aware of it, said to them, Why do you reason because you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive nor understand? Is your heart still hardened? Having eyes, do you not see? Having ears, do you not hear? And do you not remember? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of fragments did you take up? They said to him, 12. Also, when I broke the 7 for the 4,000, how many large baskets full of fragments did you take up? And they said 7. So he said to them, How is it you do not understand? Again, very much a test for the disciples here. But what he's showing them, in a sense, is that they're blinded. Right? They're not able to see the truth. They're looking past it. They're looking over it. And that's what he's communicating to them here. How did you not remember these things? Now, Jesus, being the perfect teacher, takes this moment to use bread as a metaphor. Right? He just did this miracle, feeding 4,000 people. Then he relates it back to bread, right? It's fresh in their minds. And so he starts talking about the leaven of the Pharisees and of Herod. Now, the disciples start to panic, right? They start feeling around in their robes. Oh my gosh, we don't have any bread. Their focus is on what they have and what they don't have, not Jesus. And that's why Jesus says, do you not understand already? Do you not have eyes to see or ears to hear what you have experienced? They were so focused on that one single loaf that they had that they started to fret. They started having anxiety because, oh no, here we go now. We're out of bread again. But that's not what Jesus was teaching them at all. He's saying, beware of the sinful nature that's in the Pharisees and of Herod. See, the disciples should have understood this. This was a big part of who the Jews were. You remember, again, back when we were studying the Exodus, the night before they left Egypt, they were commanded by Moses to get all the leaven out of their house. You remember that? They were to clean it completely out of their house. And then they were to bake bread without leaven in it. And that's what they were to take with them as they left Egypt. And the picture of that was that they are to set aside the sinful nature, set aside the lust of the flesh, and focus on the spiritual, focus on the Lord. That's the picture that was being taught for the Israelites. In fact, you guys have probably also heard of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. That's a 7-day feast that follows Passover. Passover is actually one day that's celebrated, and then 7 days following that is the Feast of Unleavened Bread, when the Jews were only to eat unleavened bread. Leaven, essentially, if you guys don't already know, is just yeast. That's all it is, right? It would make their bread puffy, kind of like what we're used to now. But it was symbolic for so much more. Because what leaven would do, and this is why it was such a picture of sin, is that they would take a loaf that had already risen, pinch off a little tiny bit of dough, and then go put it in a brand new chunk of dough that they had just made with flour, water, whatever other ingredients they put in it. And that leaven would multiply. It would chemically react with the dough and permeate through the dough, making that one puffy. And so they would do that again and again, and the process would repeat. And so what Jesus is saying here is that just as you take that lump of dough and put it in the larger lump of dough, that's what the teachings of the Pharisees are going to do. It's going to spread. That sinful nature is going to grow in you. Same with Herod. What the things that they're telling you is going to spread. It's going to hurt your faith. It's going to feed the sinful nature that you already have. And that's what Jesus is warning them about here. And we can think about this, just to apply it to our everyday lives now. Think about what's being fed to us. What's the news always feeding us? What's the government or Herod continually trying to feed us? Lies, right? It's all lies. News, the government, false teachers teaching incorrect doctrine, right? It's like leaven. We take that stuff in, it spreads. And so we're to be aware of those things, just as the disciples were to be aware of the Pharisees and Herod. And that's one way that we definitely can directly apply that. But remember, Jesus isn't speaking of literal bread here, right? We all get that. Jesus referred to himself as the bread of life, meaning that it's spiritual. It's the spiritual bread that's important, not the literal bread, right? Don't we often go to the Lord and say, Jesus, I only have this one loaf of bread. What can you do with this one loaf of bread? Jesus says, I'll multiply it. I'm going to work a miracle. I'm going to feed 4,000 people out of that one loaf of bread. And that's the kind of mentality and attitude that we need to have, right? We shouldn't look at the physical, that one piece of bread that is so small and so insignificant. What the Lord wants to do in your life is great and big. And so we need to lean on the spiritual. And that's what Jesus is trying to drive throughout this whole process. He's saying to the disciples, why are you blind? Why are you deaf? Let me bring this verse back up again. Look at what Jesus healed in the people. Blindness, deafness. Jesus already healed all these things. Now, these are not only physical healings, right? This is spiritual healing that he brings to you and I. He heals us of our spiritual blindness. He makes it so that we can walk again. And that's what he's saying to the disciples. Are you still wrestling with these things that I've already healed you from? And so we come back to that, the name of the message today. Don't be spiritually blind. God's already healed your blindness. We're just not to walk in that blindness. Let's finish up this next section. It has to do with blindness. Verse 22 through 26. Then he came to Bethsaida, and they brought a blind man to him and begged him to touch him. So he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the town. And when he had spit on his eyes and put his hands on him, he asked him if he saw anything. And he looked up and said, I see men like trees walking. Then he put his hands on his eyes again and made him look up. And he was restored and saw everything clearly. Then he sent him away to his house, saying, neither go into the town nor tell anyone in the town. All right, so now Jesus and his disciples, again, they get in the boat, travel to another area. Here they have gone to the northernmost point of the Sea of Galilee. And there's a town there called Bethsaida. Jesus goes there often. It comes up many times in the gospel accounts. But as they arrive there, the people bring a blind man to him. And this is, again, a very interesting healing, similar to what we saw last week. You might even argue it's just as strange as the one we read last week. But there's something fascinating here. Jesus leads this blind man out of town. He takes him to the countryside to heal him. And I don't know what the spiritual significance of that is. I just found that really fascinating that he led him out of the city to perform this miracle. This is kind of an unusual healing that we read of here. It's not of the typical formula of what we see Jesus healing people of. Now, we're told that he spit in his eyes. Remember last week he used spittle to heal the deaf man? Now he's doing it with the blind man. And it's quite possible that this was as much practical as it was symbolic or spiritual. One thing I read and learned that back then, they didn't have much in the way of eye drops or eye salve. They did have some, but especially amongst the poor, they weren't able to get those things, to anoint their eyes with. And blind people struggled with their eyes getting gummed up and sealing shut, essentially. And so one of the things the Lord is doing here is that he's literally rubbing the guy's eyes and opening them. But what I think is even more fascinating about this healing is that the guy isn't healed instantaneously. This is the only healing where we read a progressive healing. And it's kind of interesting. In fact, it's only found here in the Gospel of Mark. The other Gospels don't record it. But what he does to this man is, he opens his eyes, and all the man says is, I can only make out men walking that look like trees. Okay, that tells us that this man at one point did have sight. He knows what trees look like. He knows what men look like. But he's not completely healed. His vision is so blurry that he can barely make out the shapes. But then Jesus lays his hands on him again, and this time he's healed. And I believe that this is very applicable to what we've been studying all here this morning. Because remember, Jesus has healed us of our spiritual blindness. But it might be a progressive healing. This might take time for some of our blindness to develop. And I think that's one of the things the disciples were struggling with, right? Even after the second feeding, what did Jesus say to them? Are your hearts still hard? Do you still not understand? Do you still not believe? And so Jesus has done everything to open our eyes, but sometimes we still see dimly. We're like the blind man often that was in his initial phase of healing, but he can't fully see, right? He can't see clearly. I've got a verse to share with you that speaks to this truth as well. It's in 1 Corinthians 13:12. It says, for now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then I shall know just as I also am known. See, our spiritual lives, especially in these fallen bodies and in this earth, is like looking into a mirror. Now, the type of mirrors, I think I've shared this before, but the type of mirrors that they had in that day, they would just take a piece of metal and polish it. That was your mirror, right? You would be able to see your reflection better in a small pool of water than you would the mirrors of that day. And that's what Paul is relating this spiritual truth to. He says that it's like you looking into a mirror. You can't fully see clearly. You can't see the details of your own face. But one day you're going to be face to face with the Lord, and there's going to be no obstruction. You're going to be able to see the way you are as the way you are seen. And so often the way we look at things with our spiritual eyes is foggy, right? We're seeing a little bit foggy. But this should not encourage us not to keep our eyes open, right? Again, the encouragement is not to be spiritually blind. Keep opening your eyes. Keep trying to focus on what the Lord has for you. Pray for clarity. Pray for clear vision. This is the battle that we're up against, right? None of us have 20/20 spiritual vision. And that's not on the Lord, it's on us. Right? We mess up our own vision because of our doubt, our unbelief, our hard-heartedness. It's like we purposely make ourselves blind, right? And so that's the challenge for us this morning. But remember the prophecy that we looked at in Matthew 11:5. Jesus has already done the healing, right? We just have to keep going to him. Keep asking him to open our eyes so that we can see the spiritual battle clearly. Right? Because in our flesh, we're so tempted to look at the temporal, to look at the physical. I only have this one loaf. And the Lord's just saying, if you only knew, I've got thousands of loaves of bread for you. Don't put your hope in that one loaf. Put your hope in the Lord. Amen? We're going to close in a worship song and a prayer. So if you guys want to stand with me, we'll close in